The history of the world, unfortunately, includes many bloody battles. These battles not only caused destruction but intense emotional conflict and fatalities. Many of the restless souls never left the battle scene and continued to haunt the environment. For centuries, Afghanistan has seen many battles, and the following are 5 paranormal stories from that troubled country. The Phantom Figure. A soldier reported a mysterious figure that appeared around the outskirts of their camp and suddenly vanished. It appeared a little after dusk, about 200 yards from their position. One of the men told the others that there was a person out in the wilderness just standing there, and in the darkness he could just make out a dark shape. The sergeant was called over and saw it too. When he asked where the figure had come from, the private explained that it had suddenly appeared from nowhere. The strange figure would stand motionless with his back to them, and they watched the figure for about 3 hours, still with his back to them. The figure looked to be an adult male, of average height and build. But when they observed it through a thermal camera, they were shocked to see that it registered no heat signature, and then it disappeared in front of their eyes. About 6 months later, the same soldier was out on patrol when 2 of his unit reported seeing 2 figures standing a couple of 100 yards away. They stopped the vehicle to check them out, where they appeared to be just 2 men standing with their backs to them. They were motionless and would not respond when spoken to, just as previously happened 6 months earlier. The lieutenant called it in, and some of the men got out to further investigate. The lieutenant and his men came back with weird looks on their faces and said, "We're out of here." They later claimed that as they got within 50 yards of the figures, they suddenly disappeared in front of them. The Smoking Entity. Private Jerry Aberdeen was stationed in Mosul, Nawar Province, Afghanistan in 2004, when a call went out on the radio that the airfield was under attack. All available infantrymen jumped into the closest vehicle and headed to the airfield to counter the attack. Private Aberdeen was in a vehicle with some other infantrymen, and when they got to the airfield, they saw some men trying to climb over the wall. One of the soldiers opened up on them, and the rest of the soldiers took up position in a ditch on the other side of the road, where they returned fire. There were 3 soldiers alongside Aberdeen, and one of them suddenly fired as they witnessed one of the enemy dropping from the top of the wall. Immediately after he fell, there was a stream of black smoke coming out of him. The engineer made a comment that he must have been wearing a suicide vest that had malfunctioned. A few seconds later, the black smoke grew larger and started to take on a human form. What happened next was witnessed by all 3 men, leaving them totally shocked. The shape that had materialized into black smoke was now standing upright with red glowing eyes and a weird-shaped mouth. The strange figure actually smiled at them and turned to run, but suddenly dissolved into nothing after taking a few steps. For a split second, all 3 men looked at each other, wide-eyed. After the incident, the men only discussed it once and had never spoken about it since. The Haunted Outpost. Observation Point Rock was captured from the Taliban in 2008 and is situated near the ruins of an ancient fort. The post also has a reputation for being haunted. It was said that a short time before some US Marines arrived, some Taliban fighters had been buried alive in the caves below. As the Marines were digging, they also came across the remains of Russian soldiers that had apparently been executed in the 1980s after being found by the Mujahideen. It is therefore not surprising that with the history of violence and the many bodies that are buried there, that weird reports started to come out amongst the soldiers stationed there of strange phenomena. Strange noises were coming from nowhere, objects moving by themselves, strange lights, screaming, and the sound of footsteps walking on gravel, but on inspection found there was nobody there. The strange events created a feeling of dread amongst the men. They also found that electrical equipment would regularly malfunction, and newly installed batteries would go dead within minutes. They could also hear machine gun fire or the sound of incoming rockets, but they could not hear the bullets, and the rockets did not land or explode around them. The soldiers would see unusual lights in the sky at night. Before the Americans arrived, the post had been occupied by British soldiers who had also reported strange phenomena, and some of them had warned the Americans what to expect there. The US soldiers saw dancing lights through their night vision goggles. They would often hear voices coming from nowhere and screams coming from the desert at night. One night, Corporal Jacob Lima was startled by a chilling scream that came from one of the men, and when he ran to investigate, he found Corporal Zolik cowering in fear at his guard post. Corporal Zolik claimed that as he was at his post, he'd felt something breathe in his ear and heard a clear voice whisper something in Russian. The soldier was so terrified that he begged Lima to stay with him until his shift was over. As they waited together, they could hear footsteps coming from the observation post above them, but they knew that nobody should have been there. Other soldiers claimed that they would regularly hear disembodied whispers of what sounded like Russian around the outpost. One night, Corporal Lima was scanning the area with thermal imaging and saw what looked like another soldier standing out in the desert and went out to investigate, but when he reached the spot, the figure vanished in front of him. The soldiers kept a dog at the post called Ugly Betty, and one night, when Lima was on duty, he saw the dog barking frantically at something and feared they may be under attack. Lima then put on his night vision goggles and saw a figure in the distance. He quickly switched the goggles to thermal imaging, but the figure had vanished. But when he switched the goggles back to night vision, the figure had reappeared, but this time it was much closer. When he switched them back to thermal, again it picked up no heat signatures, but Lima could still feel its presence. As he switched back, the figure had now completely vanished, but then felt a heavy tap on his shoulder. When he quickly turned around, there was no one there, yet the dog continued to bark. The Phantom Lieutenant. A returned soldier claimed to have encountered a ghost during his service. It happened as he was sitting with 4 fellow servicemen in a makeshift office with 3 rooms. He said he was standing near the back door and noticed his lieutenant step through the door. He could see the man clearly with a moustache and wearing a flame-retardant suit and thought nothing of it as the officer walked into the next room. 30 seconds later, a call came through asking for the lieutenant, and the witness went into the other room to inform him. Strangely, the room was completely empty. Nobody was there. Since there was no other door out of the office, the witness asked if anyone had noticed the lieutenant leave, but nobody had. There were 4 other men in the room, yet nobody noticed the lieutenant. He just disappeared. The witness even looked outside but could find no sign of him. The lieutenant had just disappeared into thin air. Someone had walked in and nobody came out. The Rocks. A Marine who had served in Afghanistan and Yemen from 2009 to 2013 told of a strange event that happened one evening around 1 a.m. He had just finished setting up a patrol base with 4 other men in his squad. 17 other soldiers were asleep. In front of the base was a huge open field and to the left was a cemetery. As the Marine was looking out over the field whilst on duty, a rock came flying through the air and landed at his feet. He thought it strange as he peered into the darkness over the field, which was wide open, and there was nowhere for anyone to hide, and he could see no movement at all. The Marine continued to observe, and then another rock came flying towards him from the open field. He decided to put on his infrared night goggles, but could pick up no heat signals. The night was silent and still, and there was nobody in the field. Then another rock was thrown at him, and he was now totally confused and unnerved. The Marine was able to see 360 degrees around him, and would have been able to see who was throwing the rocks, but the rocks appeared to come out of nowhere.